Welcome back, my students. So another video where we keep math simple and easy to understand. So in this lesson, we're going to basically look at a function. And I want you to think of it in the following way. So suppose you want to send a message to your friend on WhatsApp. So obviously you would type in hello, and we would refer to that as an input. And then obviously the computer then would process that information from zeros and ones, and your friend would basically see the output hello on the screen. And that's basically the process that a function follows. So there's an input, process, and an output. Now we will use the same idea with that of a function. Now before we get to that, my promise to you is very simple. Is at the end of this lesson, you're going to understand what is meant by domain, range, what a function is, how to identify whether it's a function or not, and we're going to make use of what is known as the vertical line test. So let's get into it. So first of all, let's look at what is meant by domain. Now, domain is basically the set of input values of a relation, and what that basically means in simple terms is just the x values, right? So if I give you a table, obviously, and this table is has two columns, an input column, and we're going to put all the x's in that column, and an output column, and we'll put all the values there in the output column. Now, when we talk about the domain, we're just talking about the input values. So we're just basically talking about the x values, right? So if you look at this function, which is y is equal to x squared. We just look at this function. Now, obviously, if I put in, let's say, if I put in these values in here, I'll get the output. Now, we are basically looking at all these x values here, right? As you can see here. So if we should continue with this table and we put in -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, etc., 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 we'll basically plot all these points on the x-axis, as you can see here, displayed on this graphic here. And you can see that if we should continue, the graph would continue in direction of the arrows indefinitely, so it wouldn't stop. So clearly, the input values here in this table would basically just be -2, -1, 0, and 1. All right, so that's basically the domain. So the domain, in simple terms, is just the x values. All right, and you can see here in the table, it's -2, -1, 0, and 1. Right, so those are my domain values. Now let's look at the range. So the range now is just the output values, as you can see here in the table. So we have 0, 1, 2, and 3, and those are my range values. And you can see here, we're just basically looking at the y-axis, or the values that's on the on the y-axis rather. And you can see it being displayed right here. And you can see, obviously, the graph would continue if we should continue with the output values, right? So we only have a few, which is 0, 1, 2, and 3. So those are my range. But should we continue, it would go right into infinity. As you can see, we just represent that it's going to go, that it's going to continue with this little arrow, right? That's it. Simple, easy to understand. All right. Now let's look at what a function is. So a function is basically just a special type of relation that pairs each domain value with exactly one range value. All right. So let me explain that with an example. So let's look at this. So give the domain and range of the relation, and then tell whether the relation is a function. And then, of course, you have to explain why you say it's a function. So here we have the values, 3, -1, 5, -1, 4, 0, 3, 1. So the domain, like we said, is just the x values, 3, 5, and 4. The range are just the y values, -2, -1, 0, and 1. Now, it's not quite clear whether you can see it or not, but if you should plot it in the Cartesian plane, you would be able to see it very clearly. So 3, -2 is this point right here. 5, -1 is that point right there. 4, 0 is that point right there. And of course, 3, 1 is right there. Now, we're going to make use of a method which is known as the vertical line test. And the vertical line test helps us to see whether a relation is a function or not. And how does it work? It basically works like this. If I take this little pencil, you can see it's drawing a line. So if I take this line and I hover it over and I move it horizontally and it touches or goes through one or more points, two or more points, then it's not a function. All right. So clearly we can see that the same input t has two different outputs, which is 1 and -2. So it's not a function because a function is each domain, in other words, each x value must exactly have one y value or range value. All right. So this clearly is not a function. All right. So let's look at another example. So here we have the values for -8, sorry, -4, -8, and 4, 5, right, in our map. So as you know, the first is the x, and these are obviously the y. So if you look at this example, the question is, we need to establish whether it's a function or not, and then of course we need to explain, all right? So we have -4, 2, -8, 2, 4 and 1, 5 and 1, all right? So the domain will just basically be all of these values right here, as you can see there. And the range would just be all of these values right there. And if we plot it in the Cartesian plane, you can see 4, 2, -4, 2 is right there, -8, 2 is right there, and 4, 1 is right there, and 5 and 1 is right there. If we use a little vertical line test, we can see that the line only goes through that point -8, 2. The line only goes through that point -4, 2. The line only goes through that point 4, 1, and the line only goes through that point 5 and 1. So it basically passes the vertical line test, hence why this will be obviously a function. All right. So let's look at another example by using the vertical line test. And so I'm just going to go over to GeoGebra. So if I should slide this little vertical line, you can see it touches the graph right there at one place, and one place, one place, one place. So it basically passes the vertical line test. So thank you to Josh for creating this applet on GeoGebra. Let's look at another function. Let's just make that see. So here we have another function, y is equal to x cubed. So if I move my vertical line, it should only hit in one place right there, right there, right there. So basically the vertical line test, and what this little applet does, it is checking for that, whether it only touches the graph in one place, then it passes. If it touches the graph in more than one place, obviously it will fail, and you can see it now in this next example right here, which is circle quickly. Okay. Now here we have a circle. So if I should use my vertical line test, if I should sweep this vertical line to the right hand side, let's see whether it passes this vertical line test. And you can see right there it's failing. Why? Because it touches the graph in this place and in this place. So in more than one place. So hence why this is obviously not a function. Why? Because it's failing the vertical line test. All right. Okay, so let's look at one more example. So suppose I give you a set of coordinates. Now, I want to know whether it's a function or not a function, all right? So just keep in mind that every input has only one output, all right? And we know that the input is the x value and the output is the y value. So let's look at it. So the domain for number 1 will just be all of these x values, so 0, 1, and 1. But I'm not going to rewrite the ones more than one. I'm not going to repeat it. I'm just going to write it down. Okay. So we have 0. So we have 0 and 1. What about the range? The range, well, that will just be all the y values. So 5, 2, and so we have 5, 2, and 4. Now, is this a function? Well, does every input only have one output? Well, in this case, we can see the answer is obviously no. Now, why is that? Because the input of 1 has a 2 as an output, and it also has an output of 4. So this 1, as you can see here, the same input has 2 different outputs. So that's not a function. And of course, if we should graph them, and you can check it out, obviously using this one, and you'll see it will fail the vertical line test. So let's look at number 2. So number 2 would obviously be to answer the question of just to write down the domain. So the domain will be all the x values, so 3, 5, and 3. So 3, 5. I'm not going to write down the 3, right, because it's repeated. Now I just want you to look at this note. Look for repeated elements in the domain. As soon as an element in the domain repeats, watch out. Okay, then you should know. Okay, it's probably not a function. Why? Because it repeats, and you can see here the 3 and the 3 repeats. So clearly, we know that obviously it's not going to be a function. All right. So let's continue. What's the range? The range would just be all the y values. So a, x, and d. So a, x, and d. Right. So this is not a function. Why? Because some of the elements are repeated, and that would be the inputs. So if the inputs repeat, we know not a function. All right. So number 2 done. Now let's do number 3. So number 3, once again, all the x values. So that will be a, z, and a. So that will be our domain. So a, z. Right. So we can see that the a's, they are repeated. So clearly, that will give us an indication that it's probably not a function. The range will just be all the y values, so 3, 33, and 1. So 3, 33, and 1. And clearly, it's not a function. Why? Because the same x value has 2 different y values, so it's not a function. The last one, the domain, I think you get the hang of it now. So that will just be the x values, so x, c, and a. So x, c, and a. The range should just be the y values, so 6, 3, and 8. So 6, 3, and 8. 6, 3, and 8. So there's no elements that repeat. So this one right here, this will definitely be a function. All right, it's definitely a function. And that's basically how we do it.